music academy was quiet at night, almost too quiet. The sound of footsteps echoed softly through the long hallway, the smell of polish and paper mixing in the air. The classrooms were empty now, lights dimmed, and the piano room stood still. Only the moonlight through the tall window touched the glossy keys. That was when Mara came, the janitor with tired eyes and gentle hands. She wore simple clothes, her shoes a little worn, and she carried a small bucket and a mop, moving slowly, quietly, as if she didn't want to disturb the silence all day. The rooms were filled with music, bright, sharp. Proud notes played by the students under Miss Clara's watchful eyes. Miss Clara was the piano instructor everyone respected and feared a little. She had perfect posture, neat hair tied in a bun, and a voice that carried across the hall like the sound of the piano itself. She demanded perfection from everyone, and she never smiled when a student made a mistake. To her, music was not only art, it was discipline. Control and elegance Mara saw her every day, but Clara never really saw Mara to Clara. She was just the janitor, the woman who mopped the floors, emptied the bins and cleaned up the chalk dust after long lessons. But for Mara, the piano room was something else. When she finished her work late at night, she would stop by the room for a few moments before turning off the lights. She would look at the grand piano standing in the center, shining under the soft light. It felt like a friend she could never talk to but always understood. Sometimes she would stand near it, her fingers hovering above the keys but never daring to touch them. She had seen Clara play, how her hands moved fast, how the sound filled the whole room with emotion and power. Mara didn't understand all the musical terms or the lessons, but she understood what it felt like, the way the music made her heart ache, or smile or dream for a moment when she was a little girl. She used to press broken piano keys she found in the junkyard near her house, pretending to make music. But life had other plans. There was never time for lessons or instruments. She had to work early to help her family, and the music stayed as a dream in the corner of her mind. Every night after everyone left, she cleaned the room slowly, carefully, almost with love. She wiped the piano gently, her reflection faint in the black surface. She always smiled at that reflection, tired but peaceful. Sometimes she hummed softly, trying to remember the melodies she had heard Clara play during the day. She didn't know their names, but she remembered their feelings. There was one tune in particular that always stayed in her head, something soft and sad, and she would hum it over and over, her voice blending with the whisper of the night. One evening, the wind was strong outside, rain tapping softly against the window. Mara had finished her work early, but she didn't want to go home yet. The city outside was cold and dark, and the piano room felt warm, safe, familiar. She looked around. No one was there, no sound of footsteps, no lights except the small lamp near the piano. She walked closer, her heart beating a little faster. She looked at the keys, black and white, like rows of secrets waiting to be told. Her hand trembled as she reached out and pressed one key softly. The sound was clear, gentle, beautiful. It made her smile. A small, secret smile that only the piano could see. She pressed another and another slowly, carefully, like a child afraid to break something precious. The notes came one by one, uneven, shy but full of emotion. She didn't know what she was playing, but it felt right. Her hands began to move on their own, searching for sounds that matched her heart. It was not perfect, and some keys were wrong, some too hard, but it was hers. It was the first time in her life she truly played. The sound filled the empty room, and for a moment, she forgot who she was, not a janitor, not invisible, just a woman speaking through music. But then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart jumped. She quickly stopped playing and wiped her hands on her apron. She turned off the light and grabbed her mop, pretending to work again. Clara walked past the door but didn't look inside, too busy checking her schedule for the next day. Mara let out a shaky breath, a mix of fear and thrill. She knew she shouldn't have touched the piano, but she couldn't stop smiling. For the first time, she felt alive. She promised herself she would play again, only when the world was asleep and the hall was silent. From that night on, the empty music room became her secret world. She would come every evening after finishing her cleaning. Sometimes she only touched a few keys. Sometimes she tried to play whole melodies from memory. And every time she did, she felt her heart lighter, her soul freer. The music didn't judge her, didn't ask her who she was, it just listened. Outside, the world saw her as the janitor. But inside that room, under the dim light and the sound of her own trembling fingers, she was something more. She was someone who belonged to music, even if no one knew it yet. And in another part of the same building, Miss Clara sat in her small office, unaware that the woman she barely noticed was about to change everything she thought she knew about music. And about people. The night grew quiet again, but the sound of one secret melody still floated softly in the air, waiting to be heard by the one person who had told her she could never play. The next morning, the sun slipped through the tall windows of the academy, casting golden light over the polished floors. Miss Clara entered the piano room with her usual confidence, heels clicking sharply against the wood. Every chair was neatly arranged, every sheet of music perfectly placed, just as she liked it, yet something was different. A small detail she couldn't ignore. There on the piano lay a piece of paper, not one of her printed compositions, but a handwritten page covered in uneven notes and faded pencil marks. Clara frowned slightly, lifting it carefully between her fingers. The paper was old, the corners wrinkled, the handwriting a little shaky, but the melody was unusual. It wasn't like the structured sonatas she taught her students. It was simple, almost childlike at first glance. But as she followed the lines, she noticed something deeper. The notes rose and fell like breathing, hesitant, emotional, and real. For a long moment, she just stood there reading the music in silence. There was a tenderness in those notes, something she hadn't seen in a long time, something that couldn't be taught. She placed the paper down and sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and then she began to play. The melody filled the empty room, soft, unsure, but powerful in its honesty. It was unlike anything she had ever performed. There was no perfect rhythm, no rule-following harmony, only feeling. Each note seemed to speak a story of someone who had learned life by listening, not studying. Someone who understood the beauty of imperfection. When the last note faded, Clara sat still. Her heart oddly quiet, she didn't want to admit it. But that short piece had touched her. It reminded her of the time she first fell in love with music. Before it became competition and control. Before applause mattered more than emotion. She looked around the room, wondering who could have left it. All her students were too focused on technique, too afraid to play something imperfect. And none of them had handwriting like that. It was raw. It was real. It came from someone who didn't care about judgment. A few hours later, during her lessons, Clara found herself distracted when a student made a mistake. Instead of correcting it immediately, she listened. She heard something she hadn't before. The small moments where a mistake carried emotion. For the first time, she let a student finish a flawed piece. The other students whispered, surprised that their teacher hadn't stopped the music midway. But Clara wasn't thinking about perfection that day. She was thinking about that mysterious melody. After the classes ended, she returned to the piano room. The sheet of paper was still there, resting innocently on the keys. She turned it over, hoping for a name. A clue, anything, but the back was blank. Only faint smudges of graphite and a small fingerprint near the edge. Clara sighed softly. She told herself it didn't matter, she was a professional. She didn't have time to be curious about childish scribbles. But when she tried to file it away with her other music, she couldn't. The melody kept replaying in her head like an unfinished sentence. That evening, the janitor, Mara, came to work as usual. The students had all gone home. The corridors were quiet again. She carried her mop and bucket, humming softly. When she entered the piano room, her heart stopped for a second. The sheet of music she had left there by accident was gone. She had written that melody weeks ago. Late one night when she couldn't sleep, it wasn't supposed to be seen by anyone. It was just a piece of her thoughts, her loneliness, her memories, her quiet dreams. She had forgotten it on the piano after playing a few notes in the dark. And now it was gone. Mara looked around nervously, afraid someone had found it. If the teacher had seen it, she might get in trouble. She thought about asking, but fear held her back. She told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't a musician anyway. She was just the janitor. Yet as she cleaned the piano, she noticed something strange. The lid was slightly open and the keys were still warm. Someone had played recently. Her heart skipped. Could it be that Miss Clara had played her melody? The thought filled her with both fear and wonder. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining it. The great piano instructor playing her simple, emotional tune. She smiled shyly at the idea, even though she knew it was impossible. Then she placed her hand softly on the keys. Her fingers trembled. Remembering every sound she had written from her heart, She played a few notes again, just to hear them, just to feel them come alive. Her music was quiet, fragile, but it had truth. And just outside the door, Miss Clara was passing by. Holding her coat, she stopped suddenly. The faint melody drifted out from the room, the same one she had played earlier that morning, the same one that had touched her heart. She peeked through the narrow glass window in the door. Inside, under the soft yellow light, she saw Mara, the janitor, sitting at the piano, her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Her fingers moved slowly but beautifully. Each note echoing with feeling, Clara's eyes widened. It was her. The melody was hers. Clara watched quietly, frozen. She had never really looked at Mara before, not beyond her uniform, not beyond her cleaning cart. But now she saw something different. A woman who loved music deeply, someone who didn't need lessons to understand it. For the first time in years, Clara felt humbled. The person she had never spoken to properly, the one she passed every day without a word, was playing something that reminded her what true music sounded like. She didn't enter the room that night. She just listened, hidden by the shadows of the hallway. When Mara finished, she sighed softly, touched the piano one last time, and began cleaning again. Clara turned and walked away slowly, her thoughts tangled, her pride shaken. She didn't know what she was feeling. Admiration, surprise, maybe even guilt. All she knew was that she wanted to hear that melody again. And for the first time, Miss Clara, the proud instructor who believed talent came only from training, realized that true music could live in the most unexpected hands. Waiting quietly to be heard, the next morning, the academy was filled with the usual rush of footsteps and chatter. Students hurried through the halls carrying music sheets and whispering about their lessons. Miss Clara walked among them, graceful as always, her heels clicking like a metronome, but inside her something had changed all through the night. She had thought about what she saw, the janitor playing her piano. That simple melody had followed her home, haunting her dreams. She tried to dismiss it, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mara's trembling fingers. She heard those raw, imperfect notes that somehow felt more alive than any of her perfect performances. When she entered the piano room, the sunlight fell exactly where Mara had sat the night before. The image came back instantly, the quiet woman, her face calm, lost in her own music. Clara felt a strange mix of admiration and discomfort. How could someone like Mara, someone with no training, no background, touch music that way? The thought stung her pride, and pride was something Miss Clara guarded fiercely. Later that afternoon, she finished her lessons earlier than usual. As the students packed their bags, she told them she would be staying late to prepare for next week's recital. She didn't say why. Even she didn't fully understand it. She only knew she needed to see for herself. She waited in her office until the halls went silent and the lights dimmed. Then she walked back toward the piano room, her steps soft, her heart unsure. The door was slightly open, and the faint sound of music drifted out. Mara was there again, sitting at the piano, lost in her world. The melody was soft, pure, and full of feeling. She didn't notice Clara standing by the door. Her hands moved slowly over the keys, her body swaying with the rhythm she created from memory and emotion. It was not perfect, but it was real. Every note carried something only her heart could understand. Clara's first instinct was curiosity, but it quickly turned to anger, not at Mara, but at herself. At the feeling that someone who never studied could play something that moved her so deeply. Before she realized it, she pushed the door open, the sudden sound making Mara jump. The music stopped immediately, the silence sharp and heavy. Mara turned around, her face pale, eyes wide like a child caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quickly, standing up and stepping back. I was just cleaning. I didn't mean to." Clara's voice was cold, sharper than she intended. "Cleaning? Is that what this looks like to you?" She snapped, pointing at the piano. "You are not supposed to touch this instrument, do you understand? This is not a toy for janitors." The words came out cruelly, heavier than the silence that followed. Mara froze, her head bowed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to listen and play a little." Her voice trembled, but there was no anger in it, only shame. Clara's expression softened for a split second, but her pride wouldn't let her stop. "Stick to what you're paid to do," she said coldly, "and leave the piano to real musicians." Mara nodded quietly, her throat tight, She picked up her cleaning cloth and turned away. As she walked past Clara, she whispered almost to herself, "Yes, ma'am." And then she left the room without another word. Clara stood still, her chest heavy. The sound of the door closing echoed through the hall like a painful note. For a moment, Clara tried to convince herself she had done the right thing. Rules were rules. The piano was not for anyone to touch, but something inside her ached. She sat down at the piano and tried to play the same melody again. Her fingers moved perfectly, every note clean and precise. But something was missing, the warmth, the feeling. The life that Mara's version had, it wasn't there. Clara stopped playing halfway through, her hands trembling slightly for the first time. She felt small sitting at her own piano. Meanwhile, Mara walked home under the fading streetlights. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't let the tears fall. She had known her place for a long time, invisible, unimportant, replaceable, but tonight it hurt more than usual. Because for a few nights she had felt something special. When she played that piano, she didn't feel like a janitor. She felt like herself, someone free, someone alive, and now, even that small happiness had been taken away. When she reached her tiny apartment, she sat by the window and stared at her hands, the same hands that scrubbed floors and wiped dust. They looked rough, tired, but they were hers. She placed them on the small wooden table and started tapping softly, imagining the keys again. Even though she was told never to touch the piano again, the music still lived inside her. It was something no one could take. She closed her eyes and hummed the melody quietly, the same one Clara had once called imperfect. Back at the academy, Clara sat alone. The echo of her own harsh words replayed in her mind. She could still see Mara's face, not angry, just hurt. There was something about that quiet dignity that made Clara feel ashamed. She realized that in all her years of teaching, she had forgotten what music truly was. It wasn't about perfection or applause. It was about expression, about emotion, about truth, and the janitor, the woman she had just insulted, had all of that in her fingertips. Clara leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The sound of rain began outside, gentle and rhythmic. It matched the pattern of Mara's melody, the one she tried to ignore. She closed her eyes and listened to it, and deep down she knew she had made a mistake. A mistake that would not be easy to forget, but it was already too late. Because the music she had tried to silence was still echoing, not just in the piano room, but inside her own heart, soft, haunting, and full of truth, waiting for her to finally understand it. That night, Miss Clara lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling as rain whispered against the glass. She tried to close her eyes, tried to silence her thoughts, but the same melody kept echoing in her mind. It wasn't one of her grand compositions or the perfect sonatas she had mastered. It was that melody, the one written in shaky pencil by the janitor Mara, the one she had tried to dismiss, the one she had forbidden to ever be played again. Yet no matter how hard she tried, it lingered in her memory like a ghost she couldn't ignore. She sat up, frustrated, her hair falling loose from its tidy bun. On her desk, the sheet of music lay quietly beneath a lamp, the pencil marks faint but full of life. She picked it up again, tracing the uneven notes with her finger. The melody looked simple, but it held something deeper, something real. Each note seemed to carry a heartbeat, a story, a memory. She whispered to herself, how could someone like her write this? But her voice carried no anger this time, only confusion and a little admiration. Clara moved to her piano, sitting down slowly. The room was silent except for the rain outside. She began to play the melody again, carefully, softly, letting the notes fill the air. It was as if the sound itself breathed warmth back into her apartment. She played once, twice, again and again, trying to understand what made it so haunting. And then she realized it wasn't just the notes. It was the feeling behind them. Every hesitation, every soft key, carried emotion that couldn't be written on a page. Mara hadn't written music. She had written herself. The next morning, Clara arrived at the academy early. The hallways were still empty, the lights dim, the air cool and quiet. She entered the piano room and looked around, the same room where she had shouted at Mara. For a moment she felt a sting of regret. The words she had said, "Stick to cleaning. Leave the piano to real musicians," echoed painfully in her head. She had seen the look in Mara's eyes that night. Not anger, not defiance, just quiet hurt. Clara had always prided herself on discipline and control, but now for the first time she felt like she had failed not as a teacher, but as a human being. Later that day during her classes, Clara couldn't focus. Her students noticed something different. She was quieter, gentler, distracted. When one of them hit a wrong note, she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she listened carefully and said softly, "Do you hear that mistake? Don't fix it yet. Feel it first." The students exchanged surprised glances. Miss Clara, the strict perfectionist teacher, was talking about feeling the music. Even she didn't fully understand why her heart had softened, but she knew it had something to do with that melody. And with Mara, that evening after everyone had left, Clara found herself walking through the corridor again. Her footsteps echoed softly against the floor as she reached the piano room. She stood by the door, hand resting on the handle. She half expected to hear Mara playing again, but the room was silent. Still, she could almost feel the melody in the air, like it was hiding between the walls. She sat down at the piano and began to play slowly, carefully. The sound filled the room, fragile but honest. It felt like an apology wrapped in music. She played until the sky outside turned dark, and for the first time her heart felt light. Meanwhile, Mara was walking home after finishing her shift. Her eyes were heavy, her steps slow. She had tried not to think about the incident, but the pain still lingered in her chest. She missed the piano, missed those quiet moments when it felt like the world finally heard her. She had promised herself she wouldn't play again, not after being told she didn't belong. But sometimes, when she cleaned the room, she still touched the keys softly, just one or two notes as if whispering a secret goodbye. One evening, a few days later, as Mara was cleaning, she noticed something strange. On the piano bench lay a folded piece of paper. She looked around. The room was empty. Curious, she opened it. Inside was the same melody she had written, but this time the handwriting was neater, familiar. Miss Clara's handwriting, and next to it, a small note that said, "This is beautiful. Don't stop playing." Mara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She read the line again, just to be sure. Miss Clara, the same woman who had told her to stick to cleaning, was now encouraging her to play. Mara sat at the piano, her hands trembling slightly. She placed her fingers on the keys, her heart beating faster, and then she began to play. The same melody, the same notes, but this time with more confidence, more hope. Each sound filled the empty room like sunlight breaking through clouds. She closed her eyes, letting the music carry her. She didn't know that Clara was standing outside the door. Listening quietly, Clara didn't enter. She didn't want to interrupt. She simply leaned against the wall and smiled faintly. The regret she had carried began to fade, replaced by admiration and peace. When Mara finished, she stayed still for a moment, her fingers resting on the keys. Then she looked around the room and whispered softly, "Thank you," even though no one was there. Outside, Clara turned and walked away, her eyes glistening. She realized she had learned something her years of teaching never taught her. Music wasn't about being flawless, and it was about being human. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons didn't come from the stage or the classroom. They came from the quietest corners, from people no one noticed. That night, as Clara walked home under the fading evening light, the melody followed her again. But this time it didn't haunt her. It healed her. She smiled to herself and whispered, "She taught me what music truly means." And though Mara never knew it, her forgotten melody had changed Clara forever, because now, every time the piano keys sang, they carried a story, one of humility, forgiveness, and the beauty that hides in unexpected places. The academy was quiet again, but this time, the silence carried a secret. Miss Clara had begun staying later than usual, long after the students left and the lights dimmed. When anyone asked, she said she needed extra time to prepare for the upcoming recital. But the truth was different. She was waiting for the sound of music that had nothing to do with perfection or performance. She was waiting for Mara every night like clockwork. Mara arrived with her mop and bucket, her quiet footsteps echoing through the long hallway. She didn't know that Miss Clara often sat in the office next to the piano room. Pretending to work, Clara would leave the door slightly open. Listening, at first she felt guilty, but soon the guilt faded, replaced by a quiet fascination. When Mara thought she was alone, she would sit at the piano just for a few minutes. She'd touch the keys softly, like someone handling something precious, and then she would play. Her music was fragile and uneven, Yet it reached places inside Clara that applause never could. Each night Clara heard something new. Mara's melodies were never the same. Sometimes joyful, sometimes sad, sometimes filled with longing. Like the voice of someone who had lived through things too heavy for words. It amazed Clara how much emotion came from those rough hands. The same hands that spent the day scrubbing floors. It made her question everything she believed about talent, training and worth. Mara had no lessons, no fancy education, but she had something Clara's students lacked: soul, pure, unfiltered feeling. One night, Clara sat by the half-open door again. The corridor was dark except for the faint glow spilling out of the piano room. Mara was there, eyes closed, humming softly as she played. The melody was new, slow, tender, full of longing. Clara felt her chest tighten as she listened. The music carried something deeply personal, something that spoke of loneliness and hope all at once. She leaned closer, careful not to make a sound. The notes drifted through the air like whispers of someone's heart. Then suddenly Mara stopped. She looked around nervously, as if she could feel someone's eyes on her. Clara froze, holding her breath. Mara stood up, took a step toward the door, and whispered, "Is someone there?" Her voice trembled slightly, unsure. Clara hesitated. She could step inside, admit the truth, tell her how beautiful her playing was, but she didn't. She stayed quiet, hidden. After a moment, Mara sighed, shook her head, and sat back down. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I guess I'm imagining things," and began to play again. Clara smiled faintly, her heart full but heavy. She realized she wasn't just listening to music anymore. She was listening to a story. Each night's melody was another chapter. Through those songs, she began to understand Mara's life. The struggle, the silence, the small sparks of hope. Music was Mara's diary, and Clara was secretly reading it. And yet, the more she listened, the more she wanted to help, not as a teacher, but as someone who cared. The next morning, Clara arrived early and left a small envelope on the piano bench. Inside it was a new notebook and a note that read, "Write more. The world needs to hear you." She didn't sign it. When Mara found it later that night, she looked around the empty room. Confusion on her face, she opened the notebook, touched the clean pages, and smiled softly. For the first time, someone, even an unseen someone, believed in her. She began writing again, sketching melodies she had only kept in her head before. Little by little, her fear started to fade, replaced by quiet joy. Over the next few nights, Clara continued listening, but now she noticed something new in Mara's playing. The melodies were fuller, brighter, more confident. Mara was blooming, like a flower finally given light. Sometimes she would even laugh softly when she hit a wrong note. She wasn't afraid anymore. Clara found herself smiling too, her heart lighter with every sound. She no longer felt like a teacher listening to a student. She felt like a friend, even though Mara didn't know she was there. One evening, Clara couldn't resist anymore. She pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. Mara froze mid-note, her eyes wide with surprise. "Miss Clara," she whispered, standing up quickly. "I didn't hear you come in. I'm sorry." Clara raised a hand gently, stopping her. "No need to apologize," she said softly, her tone kind this time. "Please, keep playing." Mara blinked, confused. "But I thought, you didn't want me to—" Clara smiled faintly, walking closer. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I told you to stick to cleaning, but your music says more than my words ever could. Play, Mara, please." Mara hesitated, her heart racing. Then, slowly, she sat back down and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers trembled at first, but Clara's gentle nod gave her courage. The first few notes were soft and uncertain, but soon the melody filled the room again. This time Clara didn't just listen. She felt every note like a confession. When Mara finished, the silence that followed felt sacred. Clara took a deep breath and whispered, "That was beautiful." Mara smiled shyly, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. It's just something I play when I'm alone." Clara shook her head gently. "You should never play alone again." From that night, something changed between them. The teacher and the janitor, two women from different worlds, found a quiet bridge through music. Clara began staying late, not to listen in secret, but to sit beside her. Sometimes they played together, sometimes they just talked. Mara taught Clara to feel again, and Clara taught Mara the language of notes together. They created music that was neither perfect nor broken. It was simply true. And though no one else in the academy knew it, each night, the grand piano sang differently, softer, warmer, alive, because now, the music wasn't born from pride or rules, it came from friendship, forgiveness, and two hearts learning to listen to each other in the quiet. The nights at the academy had changed, where silence once ruled. Now soft music floated through the halls. Sometimes it was slow and emotional, sometimes playful and light, and in that music, two people who once stood on opposite sides of pride and class began to meet in the middle. Miss Clara, the proud instructor, and Mara, the quiet janitor, had found something neither expected, a shared heartbeat through music. At first their meetings were shy. Uncertain, Clara would stay after hours, pretending to go over her lessons while Mara finished her cleaning. Then, when the academy grew still, Clara would quietly invite her to sit at the piano. The first few times Mara hesitated, her hands trembling as if she still didn't believe she was allowed. But Clara's voice was gentle now, no longer sharp or proud. "Go on," she would say softly. "Let's play together." And so the lessons began, though neither called them that. Clara would show Mara the names of the notes, how to read the lines, where to pause and breathe. But soon, Clara realized something surprising. Mara didn't need sheet music to understand what sounded right. She played by emotion, not by instruction. Her fingers moved by instinct, finding harmony where others would see mistakes. Clara found herself learning from her, learning how to feel again. One evening, as they sat side by side, Mara tried to follow a simple waltz Clara had written. She stumbled a few times, missing notes. Clara chuckled softly. "No notes here, like this," she said, guiding Mara's hands gently. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment Mara froze. No one had ever touched her hands with such patience before. Her whole life her hands were for scrubbing, lifting, wiping, never for creating something beautiful. Clara noticed her hesitation and smiled. "Your hands have strength, Mara. That's what music needs. Not perfection, strength and heart." Those words stayed with Mara, more than any compliment she had ever received. Day by day they grew closer. Clara began to tell her stories from her past, how she had trained in Paris, how her teacher once told her that discipline mattered more than passion. "I believed that," Clara said one night, her eyes distant, "and I lost something because of it." Mara looked at her softly. "Maybe you just forgot how to listen." The simplicity of that sentence hit Clara harder than she expected. Yes, she had forgotten to listen to the soul behind the sound, to the heart behind the hands. Now, she found herself learning that lesson again. From the one woman she had once dismissed, the lesson was no longer about how to play the piano. It was about how to feel alive through it. Mara would close her eyes when she played, letting emotion guide her. Sometimes tears would slip down her cheeks, and Clara would quietly look away, giving her space other times. They'd laugh when the music went wrong. Their mistakes no longer felt heavy. They were just part of something real, something honest. One night the electricity went out during a storm. The academy was dark except for the faint candlelight from the piano room. Rain tapped gently on the windows as the wind howled outside. Clara lit a candle and smiled at Mara. "Well, seems the world wants us to play by candlelight." Mara laughed softly. "I've never played during a storm before," Clara grinned. "Then tonight we make the storm part of the song." They sat together, and Mara began to play. Each raindrop outside became part of the rhythm. The thunder rolled like a distant drum, and when Clara joined in, their music became something alive, wild, free, powerful. For a moment, it felt like the whole building was breathing with them. When the song ended, Mara looked at her, eyes shining in the dim light. "That felt like freedom," she whispered. Clara nodded slowly, her heart full. Yes, that's what music was always meant to be. After that night, Clara stopped calling herself the teacher. When her students asked her about her evenings, she only smiled and said, "I'm learning something new," because it was true. Every night with Mara, she discovered a part of herself she had forgotten. She learned to let go, to play with feeling instead of fear. And Mara, in return, grew more confident. Her melodies richer, her spirit stronger. Together, they weren't instructor and janitor anymore. They were simply two souls connected through sound. But Clara knew deep down that this bond couldn't stay hidden forever. The academy had rules, appearances to maintain, reputations to protect if anyone found out that she, the prestigious instructor, was secretly teaching and playing with the janitor. There would be whispers, judgment, even scandal. Yet Clara didn't care anymore for the first time in years. She felt genuine happiness, something no reputation could replace. One evening, as they finished playing, Clara turned to Mara and said softly, "You've taught me more than any master I ever had." Mara looked confused. "Me? I don't even know what I'm doing half the time," Clara smiled, her voice warm. "That's exactly it. You play from your heart, not your head. I used to do that too, before I forgot why I started." Mara blushed, looking down at her hands. "I just feel it. Like it's telling me where to go." Clara nodded slowly. "That's what music really is, Mara. It tells us where to go, if we're brave enough to follow." They sat in silence for a while, the faint hum of the night filling the space between them, and in that quiet Clara realized something important. The teacher had become the student, all her years of knowledge, all her awards and training. None of it mattered without heart. Mara had shown her what true artistry was: honesty, courage, and emotion. It was the greatest lesson of all. When Clara finally left that night, she paused at the door and looked back. Mara was still sitting at the piano, eyes closed, lost in her own melody, and Clara smiled, knowing she was witnessing something rare. A woman who had found her voice in the most unlikely place, and a teacher who had rediscovered hers through her students' silence. From that night on, the boundaries between them faded completely. They no longer met as instructor and janitor, but as equals, as two women who spoke the same language, the language of music. And every time the piano sang, it carried a truth both of them now understood. The best lessons in life don't come from books or titles. They come from the people you least expect and the courage to truly listen. The day of the Academy's annual recital arrived with the crisp scent of spring rain still lingering in the air. The great hall buzzed with excitement. Parents, teachers, and guests filled the seats, whispering, adjusting their programs, and waiting for the evening's performances to begin. Golden lights shimmered across the stage, reflecting off the polished grand piano that stood proudly at the center. For Miss Clara, this was always the most important day of the year, a celebration of discipline, talent, and her students' dedication. But this time something felt different, deeply, almost painfully different. She stood backstage, her hands clasped tightly together, her heartbeat uneven. For weeks now, she had been preparing her students as usual, perfecting every piece, every pause, every bow. But tonight her mind wasn't on them, it was on Mara, the janitor who had quietly changed her world, the woman who had taught her that music without emotion was nothing but noise, and the woman whose gift no one in this crowd knew existed. Mara, meanwhile, was far from the stage, standing in a quiet corner of the academy. She wasn't supposed to be part of the event, only to clean up afterward. She wore her usual simple uniform, her hair tied back, trying not to think too much about the music echoing from the hall. But her heart was restless. For weeks she and Clara had played together in secret. And every night Clara would whisper, "One day, you'll play for others. You have to let them hear you." Mara had laughed it off every time, saying, "Oh no, ma'am, I'm not brave like that." But deep down, the idea both scared and thrilled her. That afternoon, Clara had left a small note on the piano in the practice room. It said simply, "Tonight, play your melody. Trust me." At first Mara thought it was a mistake, but the handwriting was unmistakably Clara's. Her stomach twisted with fear and disbelief. Play? In front of everyone? Her, the janitor? It sounded impossible, almost foolish, but Clara had believed in her, more than anyone ever had. And something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was her moment back in the hall. The lights dimmed as the recital began, one by one. Clara's students performed. Elegant, precise, perfect. Their fingers moved exactly as they had practiced. But to Clara, something was missing. Each performance felt hollow. The audience clapped politely, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. She glanced toward the side of the stage where Mara stood nervously in the shadows, her hands trembling. Clara caught her eyes and gave her a small, reassuring nod. It was time. When the final student finished, Clara stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking softly. She smiled at the audience and spoke into the microphone, her voice calm but full of meaning. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said. "There's one more performance left, and a special one." She paused. scanning the faces in the crowd. This piece isn't played by one of our students. It's by someone who reminds us what music truly means. A soft murmur spread through the audience, people exchanging confused glances. Clara turned toward the wings and said warmly, "Mara, would you join us, please?" The hall fell silent for a moment. No one moved. And then slowly, Mara stepped onto the stage. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the applause that rippled uncertainly through the crowd. She looked terrified, clutching her trembling hands together. She wasn't dressed for the stage, no gown, no makeup, just her simple uniform. But in that moment, under the soft golden lights, she looked radiant in her honesty. Clara guided her to the piano and whispered softly, "Play what's in your heart." Mara nodded weakly. Sitting down on the bench, her breath shallow. Her fingers hovered over the keys, shaking. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. The same eyes that had never noticed her before. For a second, she thought she couldn't do it. But then she remembered Clara's voice. Music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. So she took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes were quiet, hesitant. But then they began to grow, fuller, warmer, alive. The melody was the one she had written in secret. The same one Clara had found weeks ago, but now, it carried all the strength and tenderness she had kept hidden all her life. The room grew still, completely silent. No one whispered, no one moved. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The music told her story, of working in silence, of dreams too small to speak, of loneliness that turned into song. Each note felt like a confession, each pause like a tear unspoken. By the time she reached the final part, her eyes were closed, tears glistening on her cheeks. When the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence, a silence that felt holy. And then, the hall erupted in applause, loud, thunderous, and full of emotion. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping their eyes. Mara sat frozen, her hands still on the keys, unable to believe what had just happened. Clara stepped forward, her eyes glistening, and placed a gentle hand on Mara's shoulder. She leaned close and whispered, "Now they've heard what I heard." Mara looked up at her. Speechless, Clara smiled softly, turning to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said proudly, "this is Mara, our academy's janitor, and tonight, the truest musician among us." The applause grew louder, the entire hall standing in respect. Mara rose slowly, her tears falling freely now. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't just someone who cleaned after others. She was seen, heard, and celebrated. Clara's students watched in awe, some with tears, some with shame. They realized that the woman they passed every day had something they couldn't learn from books or lessons. As the audience continued to cheer, Clara turned to Mara and said softly, "You've given me back my heart." Mara smiled shyly, whispering back, "And you gave me courage." Two women from different worlds stood together on that stage, bound not by titles or pride, but by music. The kind of music that doesn't just fill rooms, it fills lives. When the lights dimmed and the applause finally faded, the hall felt different. Something sacred had happened there, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen not just a performance, but a miracle. The moment a janitor reminded a room full of musicians what art truly meant. The applause had ended, but its echo stayed inside the hall like a heartbeat that refused to fade. For a long time after the recital, people still whispered about what they had witnessed that night. They spoke not just of music, but of magic, the kind that doesn't come from talent alone, but from truth. Miss Clara and Mara had both left the stage changed forever, though neither could quite put it into words. When the lights went out and the guests finally left, the grand piano stood quietly again under the soft glow of the stage lamps. Mara stayed behind, sitting alone at the bench. Her hands resting on the keys, she could still feel the warmth of the applause in her chest, the sound of hundreds of people clapping for her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a shadow in the background. She felt real, visible, alive. But beneath that joy there was a deep disbelief, as if all of it had been a dream too beautiful to last. Miss Clara stood near the doorway watching silently. Her eyes softened as she saw Mara sitting there, trembling between happiness and shock. Slowly, she walked toward her, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty hall. When Mara heard the sound, she turned, startled. "Oh, Miss Clara," she said quickly, standing up. "I was just about to leave. I didn't mean to stay so long." Clara shook her head, smiling faintly. Stay, she said gently. You've earned this moment more than anyone. They stood there in silence for a moment, the air still humming with the ghost of the melody Mara had played. Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I owe you an apology, she said, looking directly into Mara's eyes. Mara blinked, confused. An apology? But why, ma'am? Clara took a slow breath, her heart heavy with memories. Because I was cruel to you, she said softly. That first day when I told you to stick to cleaning, I was blind. I saw your uniform and not your heart. I forgot what music was supposed to be. Mara lowered her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to apologize, ma'am. I understand. People don't usually see much in me. Clara stepped closer, her tone firm but kind. No, Mara. You deserve to be seen. You have something rare. A voice inside your music that no one can teach. Her words trembled with emotion, and for the first time in years, tears touched her proud instructor's eyes. Mara's lips parted, but she couldn't find the right words, so instead, she did the only thing she could. She sat back down and began to play. Softly, slowly, the same melody as before, but now it sounded different, gentler. Warmer, full of gratitude, Clara listened quietly, and when the song ended, she clapped once, softly but meaningfully. That, she whispered, is what forgiveness sounds like. Over the next few days, the academy buzzed with talk. Students told each other how Miss Clara's recital had ended with a janitor stealing the show. Some were inspired, others shocked, and a few even embarrassed by their own narrowness. But Clara didn't care what people thought anymore. She had made her choice. And it was simple. Truth over pride, humanity over image. When the Academy Board questioned her decision to let a non-student perform, Clara met their stares with calm defiance. She played because she deserved to, she said firmly, and because she reminded us what music really means. No one argued after that. Mara, meanwhile, found herself living in a world that suddenly looked brighter. The same students who used to pass by her without a glance now greeted her warmly. Some even asked her shyly for advice at first. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't a teacher after all. But Clara told her, "You're not teaching them to play. You're teaching them to feel. And that's more important." So, in her own quiet way, Mara began helping the younger ones find emotion in their music. She didn't stand at the front of the class. She sat beside them, showing how to listen, not just to the notes, but to themselves. One afternoon, Clara walked into the practice room to find Mara surrounded by students, laughing as they tried to play one of her melodies. For a moment, Clara just stood there, smiling. It was a sight she would never forget. The janitor who had once cleaned those very floors now inspiring the next generation. When the lesson ended, Clara approached her and said softly, "You've taken my place, haven't you?" Mara blushed, shaking her head. "No, ma'am. I could never replace you." Clara smiled knowingly. "You already have, and in the best way, months passed." And Mara's story spread beyond the academy. People from other schools came to hear her play. Some called her the janitor who played her way into hearts, but she never let it change her. She still swept the floors, still greeted everyone with the same quiet kindness. Only now, when she played not from loneliness, but from love. She played because she had found her place in the world. One evening, Clara and Mara sat together in the empty piano room. Just like old times, the air was calm, the windows open. Letting in the soft scent of night flowers, Clara looked at her and said, "You know, I used to think teaching was about making others like me." Mara smiled gently. "And now," Clara chuckled softly, "now I know it's about helping others become themselves." Mara looked down, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "You helped me do that, ma'am." Clara shook her head. "No." "Mara, you helped me?" They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from peace, not amusement. Then Mara began to play again, and Clara joined her, two women from two worlds, their music blending into one voice, full of history, forgiveness, and joy. Outside, the night air carried the melody through the open window, spreading it into the quiet streets. People passing by paused to listen, not knowing where the music came from, but they could feel it, that it came from somewhere honest, somewhere human, and as the final note lingered in the air, Clara looked at Mara with a soft smile and said, "I once told you to stick to cleaning, and I've never regretted anything more in my life." Mara laughed through her tears. "Well, I still clean." I just clean hearts now too. They both smiled, and the piano sang one last time that night, not as a lesson, not as a performance, but as a thank you. A thank you to the power of kindness, humility, and second chances, because in the end, that's what their story had always been about. A proud teacher who learned to listen, a quiet janitor who learned to believe,